Hello, it's story time once again with Jeff Young. And today's story, Talent Beyond My Talents, was originally published in Fantastic Futures 13 by Pad Wolf Publishing. This is something that I decided to write because I wanted to make something that was, to my mind, inspired by Roger Zelazny since I really enjoy his writings, and at the same time, oddly also inspired by a Monty Python sketch. But we'll talk about that after the story. So this is A Talent Beyond My Talents. Avalem came to the Pillar of Night when his art failed him for what he was determined was the last time. Looking upwards at the vast cylinder where it blotted out the sun and cast its shadow across the lands to the east, he forced himself to admit his ability had not always failed him. Second thoughts gnawed at him as he tried to make a case for all the things that he was good at: painting, illuminating, drawing, writing. But on the whole, he was only just good at these. He would never excel at them, and no one wanted to pay for just good when it came to art. Might as well paint a barn, do accounting, or drafting, Avalem thought. I know I was meant for more. So when the latest commission failed to live up to his patron's expectations, Avalem left. He turned his nose to the east and walked across the lands until he came to the Pillar of Night. The story said much about the pillar, how it was the result of when the long chain makers had fled Earth, how it was hollow, how it went up so high that there was no air at its peak, and that it was inhabited. But those were not the stories that brought Avalem here. The story that moved him inexorably to the Pillar of Night was that of the Greel, a strange thing that given to a man would imbue him with a talent beyond his current abilities. He'd seen some of the art made by the Greel touched, and it was amazing. There was a depth to every piece that seemed to transcend what a mere man could make. Also, there was the fact that such pieces were priceless, and collectors of fine works fought like feral dogs over them. So Avalem was here for the Greel, here to step beyond what he was, no matter the price. Entrance to the pillar was gained through the foothills. Avalem found that the closer he approached, the less of the sky he could see, until the pillar was a vast silvery wall covered in dark gray veins. He shook his head in amazement. It was said that in the last days of their leaving, the long chain makers grew the pillar and launched themselves from its peak. They built the tesseract that floated overhead at night out of the moon, went out among the other worlds, rearranged things to their liking, and then jumped from the edge of the solar system like divers to swim for other stars. One of these days soon others would tell stories just as fantastic about him, he was determined. A well-worn path led him down into the valley. At the lowest point was the entrance to a tunnel. Just inside the tunnel, as the light began to fade, someone stepped forward and laid a hand upon his chest, bringing him to a halt. "How you planning on seeing, boy?" came a rough voice. A tiny light appeared beside the face of a gray-haired man. Avalem started and stepped backward. It hadn't occurred to him that the Pillar of Night would be completely dark. Well, there was an opening at the top, so some light had to get in. Of course, he also hadn't planned on the tunnel either. The man looked at him with a bit of a grin and offered, "Sell you this here light if you needed it." He handed the strange lamp to Avalem. It was a loop of glass containing one small bright point of light. The light bobbed about as Avalem tilted the tube. "Well, play with it or buy it," barked the seller, his arms crossed over his chest. "Silver," Avalem offered, turning the light about again. "Two, that's final." "Done." The man grabbed the silvers from Avalem's palm and turned to go into the darkness. Without thinking, Avalem asked, "Don't you need a lamp?" Looking at the lamp merchant, Avalem realized that there were a number of tubes tied together on his back, all of which were glowing. The man's eyes flashed in the half-light like an animal's outside of a fire circle. "Do I look like I need a lamp?" The merchant's footsteps faded into the darkness, and then Avalem heard him exclaim in the distance, "Don't forget to tell you. Don't forget to tell it that you love it." Crazy old man, Avalem thought, and started down the path once more. When he held out the lamp to the side, he could barely see anything in the darkness. There were no walls nearby, and the ceiling was invisible overhead. Occasionally drops of water fell on him, and the ground was rough and uneven. Avalem kept on walking. First he thought he must be tiring, even though it felt like the light was fading, and then he realized the lamp was going out, the bright point dimming away. Shaking the tube of glass produced nothing. The lamp seller had tricked him. The darkness was closing in around him, and his breathing grew hoarse. He would be trapped here, at the mercy of the strange inhabitants of the foothills that could see in the dark. With some trepidation, he cleared his throat and said, "I love you." The spark grew in a globe to the size of a grate and gave off a soft lambent light. It made no sense, but looking at the light source again, he said, "I love you, I love you." And in his own mind, he realized that he loved the fact that it was no longer dark and that he was no longer afraid. But the spark of light before him grew into a white-hot sphere that pushed at the confines of the glass tube. Avalem had to grasp the tube using the edges of his cloak to keep his hands from burning, and then he turned back to the path. The point at which he entered the Pillar of Night itself was indeterminable. A minute amount of ambient light caught his attention. As his eyes grew used to having something to lock onto, Avalem thrust the lamp under the edge of his cloak. The land around him glowed in an unexpected reddish radiance. He could see a body of water ahead that shone with a crimson aura illuminating its depths. There was a grass under his feet that was black with a single stripe glowing incarnadine down the spine of its shaft. Dark forms ahead of him could be trees, and beyond that were lights that might even be the windows of homes just at the edge of his vision. The country of night was nothing like he expected. He took several steps and then pitched forward, tripping over a rock he had not seen. Avalem pulled out the lamp once more. It would mark him as a stranger here, but the alternative was to stumble through darkness, and he just hoped his eyes would eventually adapt. He made good time for a while, walking along the edges of a game trail in the wood. Several deer, their eyes blazing golden reflections, bounded out ahead of him and crashed through the underbrush. He stole another look at the heavens. With the pinpoint of light he could see overhead growing dimmer. A few steps further and he was certain. Night in this country would mean absolute darkness, he thought, and made his way deeper into the woods. Finding a fir tree, Avalem cut down several low limbs and made himself a bower. Wrapping his cloak around him, he did his best to get comfortable. Perhaps it was the darkness, but despite his strange surroundings, he dropped off to sleep without any hesitation. When he awoke, the light was still minimal. It occurred to him as he stretched, reaching for his satchel, that the country of night would receive its greatest illumination when the sun was directly overhead. The lamp was flickering until he once again renewed his vow to it, and just as he said the word love, it brightened once again. As he continued onward, the land dipped downward. The Pillar of Night was supposedly 40 miles from one side to the other, and his goal was the sinking well at its very center. When he stepped into the stream, it occurred to Avalem that he now had a guide. All he had to do was follow the water down to the center of the country of night. Walking along, he lost any concept of time. He could see better now. Perhaps his eyes were adapting. There were no homes or buildings along the side of the stream as he trudged on. Silvery white fish with huge bulbous eyes swam upstream against the current. Their motion was disturbing and odd. Avalem hoped his food would hold out long enough until he could leave the pillar once again. The land continued to slope downward. Down and down he went, scrambling over half-seen rocks as the reddish light that passed for day here grew. The trees around the stream cut off most of the light. Despite the gloom, Avalem kept following the water. The sound of it running, gurgling, filled his ears. It kept his mind off what might be wandering in the forest unseen about him. After a time, he could see a glow of red below him as the forest pulled back away from the stream. And when he scrambled over the last rock, Avalem set the lamp down for a moment. The stream flowed across a plain until it came to a lake that glowed with red light. There were copses of trees and here and there, and large rocks that dotted the flat land. Glancing up, he could see what looked like a slender thread that hung down from the darkness overhead. White at its center, the light from the outside faded to red and then to darkness. And under that beam lay the lake, and it glowed with reflected luminance. This was his destination, he told himself. Avalem picked up the lamp and started out onto the plain. And finally, standing on the shores of the lake, his hands and cloak painted red with reflected light, Avalem breathed a sigh of satisfaction. He was here. At last he was here. He shrugged off the cloak and dropped his satchel on the shoreline. And now that he was here at the source of the Greal, he wasn't certain what to do next. The Greel lived in the lake, that much he knew, but nothing else. Hearing a footfall, he turned to discover a group of men had come up behind him. Got no idea what to do next, do you, boy? The group's largest member strode forward. He held a stout walking staff tucked under his arm. Turning back to the others, he continued, They spend all their time trying to get here, and then they have no clue what's next. This brought a chuckle from the dozen men gathered around him. The staff bearer turned back to Avalon. If you got no idea, I have a suggestion. And with that, the staff came out from under his arm, its end swinging around in an arc that ended with Avalon's head. Staggering backwards into the lake, Avalon threw up his hands in an attempt to ward off another attack. Swinging the weapon over his head, Avalon's attacker ducked in for another jab, knocking Avalon onto his back into the water. Feeling his feet give out from underneath him, Avalon kicked feebly in the water and then slid below the surface. Flailing about in the red darkness of the lake, he hit the bottom and then pushed himself back up again. Taking shuddering breaths, Avalon strode forward out of the lake. His attacker looked up from the contents of Avalon's satchel. Still haven't figured it out, have you? The man growled, hands tightening on the staff once more. Avalon crouched down in the reeds, balled his fist, anticipating another strike. The leader of the band feinted once towards Avalon's head and then swung the end of the staff hard around into his victim's stomach. The air burst from Avalon. He teetered on his heels for a moment, his diaphragm spasming. The red light wheeled overhead, and there was a rushing sound in his ears. He wasn't breathing. Knees buckling, Avalon pitched forward, and just before he hit the water, he pulled in a ragged breath and heard from his assailant, You gotta drink it, boy. You gotta drink it deep. And then Avalon was plunging into the lake, its cold water cascading down his throat instead of the next breath that he was desperate for. Reddish light exploded behind his eyes and in the water about him. He felt himself strike the bottom. The water he breathed in came choking out, and more water slid into his mouth and up his nose. His feet slipped, and his hands sank into the mud. I'm going to die here, he thought. Flowing his arms around, he pushed himself away from the mud. And for a moment, he lost the surface. There was so little light, and it was so diffused throughout the lake. In his confusion, Avalon pushed out his legs and arms, seeking any contact. He felt a grip settle around his ankle, and then he was drawn from the lake. As his head broke the water, Avalon choked up the remaining water. Soaking wet and shivering, he clung to the shoreline. Something blocked out the red light, and he drew back, grasping for air. Welcome to the night, boy. Hope you found what you were looking for. Thanks for the goods. I won't be seeing you. The owner of the voice strode off into the dark, his footfalls fading. Avalon felt his awareness start to fade. The light before his eyes wavered. He pulled at the reeds before him, trying to draw himself from the water before losing consciousness. His feet drug over the rocks of the shoreline, and then he curled into a ball, shivering and twitching with reaction. Warmth was the last thing that he expected to waken to. Clean blankets covered his nakedness, and Avalon pulled himself up to a sitting position, memories of almost drowning making him twitch. He was inside a room with minimal light. Something that looked like fishing nets hung from the ceiling, strung from corner to corner. And the more he looked about the small area, the more he saw draped from the rafters. He was on the floor, he realized, wrapped in a nest of blankets. Pulling one around his hips, he stumbled to his feet. Ducking lower to avoid the hanging strands, he walked through the small dim room to the doorway. The next room was larger, and the ceiling was once more lost in fibrous netting. But he estimated that this room, which looked to be the main room of the house, was at least 2 stories tall. He held his hand out in front of his face for a moment. Even in the dimness of the room, he could see the lines on his palms. Blinking, he looked again. He knew his hands. He used them all the time in his work. Why did they look different now? Why did the fingers look longer? He was certain the lines were not where he remembered. Even his arms felt awkward, as though his forearms were too long and didn't fit. A rustling sound from overhead pulled him away from his observations. Looking up, he saw a graceful pair of legs push through the overhanging strands. The rest of the woman who followed was lithe and slim. She smiled at him for a moment, and then coming down to touch on the floor, turned away to the other side of the room. Stopping, she looked over her shoulder. I'm very glad to find you better. Please break your fast with me in the other room. Avalem found himself following her into yet another chamber that was lit by several strange lights similar to his erstwhile lamp. His hostess touched each one in passing, and the illumination within grew brighter. In the increased light, Avalem noticed her strange garment. From some angles, it appeared a short dress, but as he turned, he could see more of her legs were covered than he remembered. Stumbling a bit over the sheet wrapped around his hips, he then noticed that her one shoulder was bare and the dress was gathered at one thigh. And looking away and back, he found the construction had altered yet again. The fabric was constantly in motion, individual strands sliding to and fro in an unsettling manner. So instead, he settled on her face. Its slim lines set into a knowing smile. She pushed her long red hair over one shoulder, and he saw something for a moment in the line of her shoulder that made him want to look twice, but already she was pulling fruit from a cabinet and setting it on a low table that sat along one wall. She drew a chair from the other side of the room, placing it down next to the single one at the table. Please, she urged him to sit down. Avalem managed the feat without falling over, but with little grace. He caught a quick smile trace its way across her face as she joined him at the table. There was bread, apples, other fruit, and despite the soreness of his throat, Avalem felt himself quite hungry. She pushed the woven basket across the top of the table in front of him and settled back to watch, hands clutching a small cup of tea. Breaking off bread, he dipped it in a small dish of honey and paused after the first bite, eyes closed in enjoyment. Her short laugh caught him by surprise. It's so good to see someone enjoying something so simple, she said, hiding her smile behind a teacup. I am in your debt for everything. Thank you for rescuing me. Avalem bowed his head briefly to his host. She made a vague gesture with one hand, and the curtains on the nearby window parted. Ignoring the view for a moment, Avalem was fascinated by the fact that the material itself seemed to unravel and then reform on either side of the view. His host's house sat just up from the shore of the lake. All sorts of things wash up here. Occasionally, I take an interest. Her eyebrow flickered upwards briefly as her smile grew more mischievous. Avalem was suddenly very aware of his lack of dress. He covered the awkward moment by reaching for the tea in front of him. The woman across from him turned to gaze out the window, and once again he caught the glimpse of something on her shoulder, close to the nape of her neck. Now, if he looked, he could see that her hair did not just fall in waves, but was lifted by something that rose from her back. I'm sorry to be rude. My name is Avalem. I should have told you that before. Interesting, but unnecessary. Out there, I am sure that you have a use for names, so that you can tie things down to your definitions. Inside, we don't care much about what one calls anything. We care about what it really is and what its potential is to be. Taken a bit back by that statement, Avalem paused with tea halfway to his lips. What do I call you? Her laugh was sweet and brief as her gaze returned to the lake. You can call me the Lady of the Lake, the Sorceress of the Night, the Greel Witch. You decide. I will know no matter what you choose to call me. Her head shot round, and she met his gaze as every thread in the entire house leapt through the air to connect to her. And for a mere instant she was a glorious spider lying at the heart of a web that encompassed every portion of her house. And just as suddenly, a ripple in the curtains by the window caught his attention, and the all-pervasive threads vanished. Avalem sat there for a moment, overwhelmed, and then cautiously he said, I think I shall just call you Lady. Her red eyebrows shot up as well as the corners of her mouth. Oh, Foundling, you and I shall get along well. When they were done with the meal, she found him trousers and a shirt of the ever-present material that filled her home. And when she led him out into the light, Avalem started to ask her why he could suddenly see, but she silenced him with the finger across his lip and pulled him down to the lake. And there they spent the afternoon walking along the incarnadine sands of its shore. And reaching down, she cupped a handful of the lake's water. The liquid ruby, the surface rippled with each one of her breaths. Do you know the story of the long chain makers? She asked. I know they remade the world and left. There's a great deal more. Years and years ago, men were trying to make intelligences other than their own. They used the tiny machines to weave great nets of logic, but it never occurred to them that the small ones would learn as they worked. Each one of the chains is forged of lines of makers, communers, and unmakers. They were all to be more than the sum of their parts, and they came together, becoming more than the whole. Avalem looked at the immensity of the interior of the Pillar of Night, and they built this. Yes, and then they changed us. They left humanity with an extended lifespan, the ability to heal most accidents, and to consume almost anything. But the long chain makers also built us a cage, taking away our ability to undo their alterations. They changed us so that we can't survive anywhere but on Earth. And then they took away all our toys, leaving us with just enough to get by. They founded a world where the works of one's hands and mind and the flavors we can enjoy became a new currency. The world became more temperate and plentiful, everywhere under their touch. And lastly, they made the griot. But even that is fading. And with that, she flicked her hair aside, and Avalem could clearly see the size of the growths that looked like shelf fungus that ran up the back of her shapely neck. In the beginning, merely a touch from the lake would have transformed you. Now those ruffians had to practically drown you before you had taken enough in. To me? The lady let her hair fall back once more with a laugh. Don't be foolish. How could you see so well if you hadn't changed? Avalem stepped back from her side and ran his fingers over the back of his neck, and then he stared intently at his hands. There's nothing yet. It's too early. What? He took a deep breath, shaking with relief and astonishment. Something that he now had that was different from everyone else. What can I do? She threw her hands up in the air, the water a shower of scarlet rain coming down. Who knows? Each ability is unique. And then she led him back to the house and between the rows of sculptured shrubs that extended on either side back into the woods. They walked the corridors of the maze until she brought them to the center and the rose garden concealed there. Scattered about were works of art clearly fashioned by the griot touch. Copper orrery spun and flashed from nothing but the air of their passing. A tree was shaped into a mermaid, leaping from the spray, and yet overhead its foliage gave them shade. A granite rock was braided like hair, and each nook and alcove hid another treasure. And when the lady led them to a marble bench, Avalem was still bemused at the variety of the wonders. They are presents from those who have found their aspect of the gift the griot bestows on them. Finally, Avalem sighed, convinced that at last his life was changing for the better. The lady reached out and laid her hand against his cheek. What you will do will be amazing no matter where your talent lies. But there are some who cannot learn to master their abilities, and others who fall under the influence of the unscrupulous. I will do my best to teach them, but you've seen how others react to what the griot touch made. Indeed, thought Avalem, and briefly found himself unable to meet her gaze. The lady continued, what you have is like a hammer. It can be used to build an edifice of towering beauty, or it can be swung with murderous intent. We'll find out together. And then I'll give you a gift that will make all of these pale in comparison. Her smile took him by surprise, two warm, twining fingers around his own. Together, they walked hand in hand back to the house, and there she stoked the closest lamp into light. Why does that work? Avalem asked. It's a talent, a griot-given talent. You mean the man in the tunnel? But it didn't explain the other's ability to see in the dark. But the I love you? The lady ran her hands across the top of the glass, and light within chased her fingertips. It's a maker of light. It works because we want it to, and it can actually sense intent. Therefore, we need to prove we need its light. But, she stopped him. It's a word we don't say often. There was a brief awkward silence. The lady finally broke. Hungry? Dinner was full of the lady casting glances through the curtain of her hair that kept falling forward in a fetching way, and as the light faded in the window across the table, Avalem felt no surprise that once again she reached for his hand and drew him further into the house, after the incidental touches throughout their meal. She pulled him onward, the webbing of her home growing deeper, the fabric of his clothes rustling with its own. Her own were unweaving before his eyes, more and more of her milk-white skin available to him, and when she drew her hands to him, he felt his own shirt and pants slough away and rejoin the mass of the threads about them, threads that swept under their feet and buoyed them up, threads that wove them into a vast cocoon sealing out the world. And then the giant web that it was, all of the strands in the house began to sway with the gentle motion that their joining imparted. And when he woke in the darkness due to nature's need, Avalem wondered briefly how he might find his way down to the floor. The nest reacted to his turning and unknitted itself in such a way that he was able to exit their bower without disturbing the lady. He found himself bemused for a moment, looking at her splayed form, the fall of her breasts, and the way that her tresses merged into the strands of the net. She turned, and her shoulder came into view, and the design that broke its alabaster skin drawing his attention back. There was a rose, raised above the surface of her skin. A filigree of woven skin lay across its stem and petals holding it in place. The stem grew from the lady's skin at the base and joined several of the petals on the underside of the flower that were also joined to her. Shock filled him, and for a moment only she breathed. Looking at his hands, the inevitable revelation came. I've done this. Avalem fled. Whipping strands across his path, he found his way back to the room where he first awoke and threw open the closets there until he discovered most of his clothes. Beneath them also his satchel and the lamp. For an instant he was drawn further into shock. Why would the lady have these things? Could she have recovered them from the pack of ruffians? Or rather, had she actually had them cast him into the lake? And no matter how hard he looked, he could not find his shirt, but in another closet was one made of the lady's material. His hands were shaking as he drew on her shirt. He gathered up his belongings, sliding once more along the webbing, fearing to signal the spider at their heart of its departure. And only when he cleared the doorway did he breathe a sigh of relief. Walking through the forest, returning to the entry tunnel, Avalem once again considered the surface of his hands. Was there more detail to the lines that traced his palms? How could these ordinary parts of him that he had known forever and used all these years accomplish what he had discovered? The more he thought about the entire strange occurrence, the less sense it made. He would admit to having a strange dream where roses grew throughout the web while he and the lady lay there in each other's arms. Their sickly sweet odor had clung to his sense of spell, and when he turned away, the thorns had dug into him, waking him from his sleep. They had dug into his hands. How foolish of him! All artists use their hands, and where else would he have imagined the griot coming to work such a transformation? But what could he do with a talent like this? It was almost worse than he was before. Avalem's head sank forward as he continued to trudge along. Changed forever, but who was to say if such a change was for the best? He passed into the tunnel and exited the land of night. It was a week later that he came upon the girl drawing in the dirt, her left arm hanging limply at her side. Something was wrong with him, and Avalem couldn't understand it. He wasn't able to explain why he'd come here. Once the pillar of night became a smudge in the distance, he deliberately avoided villages. Going out of his way to stay away from others became the norm. Going along and staying from them made sense to him. His hands itched incessantly. At night, he forced them into his satchel, drawing the string tight with his teeth. And several times he blanked out and discovered himself with his arms plunged into the ice-cold streams of the area. The back of his neck was full of strange bumps that grew day by day. And now Avalem was stumbling up to her, reaching for her dragging limb. And some part of his awareness was bemused by the fact that her arm was so damaged. The gifts of the long chain makers altered human physiology so that such a break would easily heal. But something must have gone wrong. And in the instant his fingers touched her arm, all of the confusion and irritation in his fingers passed away. She had a moment to look up at him, confused before the griot acted, and then its insidious strength was pouring into her, reworking the very nature and stuff of her limb. Some portion of him was aware of the griot as it flickered through possibilities until it settled upon an answer. And then a wave of heat cascaded from his reworked digits, both making and unmaking at the same time. The end result gave him a brief sense of satisfaction until he later attributed to the Greel, and then a growing sense of horror at what he had done. This stranger, who he'd never met and spoken to, now had a new arm. This limb was a helical weaving filled with spiraling filigrees whose bones and joints were refashioned into not an efficient but also an elegant form. The skin was woven over the entire construct, but not so densely as to hide the new architecture within. Avalem had never seen anything like it. He'd taken her broken arm and made it into a work of art. And maybe, just maybe, his talent did have value. And that was when the other man grasped his shoulder and threw him to the ground. While Avalem lay there staring at the hulking figure that reached for the long, curved threshing blade that hung at his waist, he felt the need rising from the Greel once more. It wanted him to lay hands on the other, to remake him, to string the sinew differently, to reorganize the skin and weave and bone into something amazing, and the sensation overwhelmed him. But he did not move quickly enough to stop the stranger from lopping the arm from the girl. Shock overwhelmed Avalem. Instinctively, he knew that the arm would grow back, and then it would be straight and whole once more. It was like the beating he'd received at the side of the lake of the Pillar of Night. Mankind's bodies were designed to take so much more punishment now that it was very difficult to truly hurt one another. However, the Greel influence part of him also wondered just in what state the limb would return. The natural repair processes of her body must have failed before leaving her with a useless limb. Avalem had just enough time to observe that her bleeding had stopped completely and the skin of her back was stretching to cover the missing area before her assailant turned on him. "Whatever you did to my daughter, I won't stand for it. She'll have a perfectly good arm now, and not that abomination you created. We were only waiting until she was ready to accept what had to be done before you stepped in." The blade turned towards him, and Avalem caught the other man's wrist with both hands, once again feeling the slippery hot sensation of the Greel at work. The makers inside of him evaluated the wrist and remade it even as he turned the blow away. The metal of the scythe was raw material, reappearing as part of the architecture that resulted. It was a well-intentioned mistake, for now the farmer turned his wrist in a way that should have been impossible and captured both of Avalem's, and the rewoven flesh of metal and mesh was creating a grip that was inexorable. And then he felt the first blow strike the side of his head, and others fell about his shoulders as the villagers came to their comrades' rescue using the handles of their farm implements as weapons. Avalem's body desperately tried to keep him conscious, and he could feel the Greel at work here and there when another came within his grasp. And finally, as he curled in upon himself, he felt his own awareness slipping away. When he awoke, Avalem felt himself inside a small conical granary. The door was locked, and the light only came in through the chinks and the gaps in the masonry. And when he stood up, his shoulders brushed the sides of the enclosure. The heat and the grain dust were stifling. And worse still was the itching in his hands had begun again. The Greel was anxious once more to alter flesh after he had finally used his talent. Sitting down, he wrapped his hands in his shirt. He wasn't sure when he'd started, but Avalem began to rock, back and forth. The heat surrounding him grew as the sun rose farther into the sky. Emanations from the Greel grew more and more intense, and the walls wavered in his vision. The granary was a forge, and he felt like he was being cast anew. The lady followed Avalem. She knew wherever her work went, and the material of his shirt called to her. But its song was growing weaker when she rose in the morning and rapidly fading away. Still, she suspected that she would not have to look farther than the village that lay in the valley below her. And when she walked down its central road, a small crowd of children flowed about her on either side, noisily playing with strange toys. There were mechanical birds who sang sweetly, flying creations that spun of their own accord, lifting into the air, musical instruments, and more. And from each, lady felt the strange, vague echo of her work. And when she looked carefully, the parts seemed to be carved from ivory or bone and bound with tanned thongs. And beyond the children, the men and women of the village picked through a bounty of knives, tools, and baskets, all strewn about from the remains of the final of 3 granary towers. Possibilities flashed through her mind. The lady knew that Avalem was here. all about her now. The Grille had remade him entirely, frustrated at its inability to act when the villagers had locked him away. Unconsciously, she rubbed at the back of her neck. But why, she wondered. And then it came to her, truth she had not expected. Avalem's Grille was a tool too valuable to be wasted. For the first time in untold years, something was at last loose in the world that could undo the very chains that bound humanity to Earth, because it could alter human physiology. Avalem's Grille could reverse the changes made by the long chain makers. She felt certainty that each and every piece that resulted from his transubstantiation bore the Grille to its new owner. More than likely, a new version of the Grille, better tempered and less likely to consume its host. The ability would spread from person to person, a plague of possibility where before there had been none. Lady's hand came down to rest on the rose etched into her shoulder as she remembered waking last night and staring up at the stars. In the pillar of night, she'd long since forgotten the simple joy of considering their multitudes. What wonders awaited them out there now? At last they could walk the path that the long chain makers had laid down long ago. There was, however, still a long way to go before humanity could leave the earth. But every journey began with a single step. And she knelt down and reached for the nearest toy. The puzzle box slowly unfolded under her inquisitive fingers, and she was not surprised to find the rose hidden at its heart. And that is a talent beyond my talents. So that story was originally published in Fantastic Futures 13 by Padwell Publishing. And as I said, it was something that I was inspired to write because I really enjoy Roger Zelazny's work. At the same time, too, I might have mentioned Monty Python. There's a sketch, of course, with the witch, where they're trying to determine whether or not this woman is a witch. And they go through a long process of trying to determine whether or not she's going to float. And they talk about a number of things that float, like very small rocks and wood. How do you know she's a witch? Well, built a bridge out of her. I, strangely enough, wanted to write a character that was built into things. And the idea being that the Grille, which is obviously a take on the Grail, is a substance that allows one to remake things. It's a maker. It's a nanobot. It creates things. And just as his creativity was frustrated because Avalem felt that he was never doing things well enough, its creativity was frustrated. And eventually what it did was it turned him into things that other people would not be able to resist picking up and using and playing with. And at the same time, too, it also propagated itself. So it's a little bit weird. It's kind of like fungus. But it's a fun story to write. I was asked to come up with a future story and a sort of far future story. And the idea being that humanity has been given a second chance now, but we've sort of been made to wait until we've grown up enough to appreciate what we had created in the long chain makers had left behind for us. So thanks for listening. And again, if you'd like to read more stories in that vein, Fantastic Futures 13 is an excellent anthology to consider.